this would be the start of the first of a series of conversations on many of your thoughts. And I would like to start with you have written recently on your Facebook page about traveling Jewish, and I would like that to be the topic of conversation for today. So maybe I should start with, how do you, with something quite personal. I mean, how do you, what do you associate with traveling when you were a child? Or
No, I didn't travel much as a child, and people weren't traveling in the 1950s and early 60s the way we used to before the pandemic. But I started traveling. I did travel to London in 1973 to study there, and before that, for a couple of months through Europe, maybe 5 or 6 countries. And at that time, I also went to the Soviet Union for 10 days, and my first trip to Israel for 10 days or so. So that was the beginning of my travel. But then it accelerated when I went to Maryknoll to teach in 1980.
mm-hmm.
And where I went to many countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And I began traveling to the Middle East, Israel, Palestine more often starting in 1984. So that's what I associate with travel. And of course, I was traveling at that time very distinctly as a Jew, because I was teaching at Maryknoll, a Catholic missionary society seminary. And it was very distinctive that a Jew would be teaching there. And wherever I traveled, being Jewish was distinctive as well, because I was traveling among non-Jews and mostly people who had never met a Jew.
And yeah, and in those, let me backtrack a bit about your, when you said you started your travel when you were a student, and then you traveled to Soviet Union. That was your first travel to Israel?
Yes, 1973, and it turned out that I was there in October 1973 when the Yom Kippur War started. So I went there to find out for myself what was going on, because I had been admonished by a Hebrew school teacher years before when I mentioned Palestinians, whom I didn't know anything about really, but I had read about them. And he was very upset, and I didn't know why he was upset, but he ended our discussion, a very heated discussion, with, "You don't know anything, you've never been there." And I thought to myself, why is he so upset? And why would he say something like that? And I don't like to be told that I don't know because I haven't been someplace. If I have a chance ever, I will go. I never knew that I would have a chance, but in London, I realized that I could travel to Israel during one of our breaks. And so I did.
And what was the experience? You said that it was the time that you actually got caught in the middle of the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, well, that was obviously very interesting. And I got to see Israel at that time in the middle of a war. I had met some Palestinians by walking through Jerusalem and going to Jericho and places like that, but didn't meet them personally so much. I was interacting with them. And I knew them essentially as Arabs of Palestine. And I didn't know much about the background of all of it, because we weren't taught anything about the formation or foundation of Israel and what happened to Palestinians. In Hebrew school, we didn't talk about that, and it wasn't much in the news, especially any positive sense of Palestinians. But when I was there, without knowing Palestinians, I could see that there was something wrong, that Jews who looked like me, who came from European background, as I did through my family lineage, were on top, and Palestinians who were, in my experience, darker skinned and people of color relating back to blacks in the United States were on the underside. And I said to myself, there's something not right here, but I couldn't really identify it beyond that. That was my first experience of Israel. And of course, also the beauty of the landscape, any stories of encounters there as a tourist, because I went alone. And then the war started, and that was a whole nother thing, hitchhiking from a kibbutz back to Tel Aviv and trying to get out, and to experience Israel under war was quite interesting.
It brings me to my own experience of traveling to Israel, but this was in 2008. And was it already, I was thinking, was it already as militarized as it was in back in 1973? Because when I visited Israel in 2008, it was so obvious that it was heavily militarized. I stayed in Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, and you would see everywhere how Israeli soldiers would go to each area, even in Muslim areas, and you would really feel the occupation in a sense. Was it already like that when you traveled in 1973?
Well, really, soldiers were always carrying guns and all, which was very different for me. And the occupation wasn't anything like it was when you were there. It was beginning. That is the occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israel itself, in its foundation, had occupied parts of Palestine. But again, I didn't really understand that when I went there first in 1973. So as time went on, each time I went back, 2004, 2006, 1986, 1987, 1988, into the first Intifada and beyond, it was much more heavily militarized and much more obvious to my eyes. And I was also learning about it, which I don't know that the word occupation in Jewish circles was even being used in 1973, and settlers were few compared to now. And it was just beginning that part of the settlement movement. You can look at Israel as a settler movement itself, but that was not on the books when I went there in 1973, at least consciously or in my vocabulary or things I had learned.
So, so you went there as a tourist, but you didn't actually feel like a tourist,
Didn't exactly go as a tourist because I decided to go because of my Hebrew school teacher who had admonished me. Now, I did go on a tourist visa by myself, and I did tour because I wanted things to do. And I didn't go there on a specific political assignment. So I wasn't a tourist, and it wasn't a political visit in and of itself. It was something that for that reason, my Hebrew school teacher primarily was the impetus for my interest in going. Otherwise, I don't think I would have ever been interested in going at all. And then I was just there to experience it without any great political intention at all. And then I got caught up in the war and saw things which I couldn't quite place or identify, but I knew something was wrong.
So when he said you don't know anything, so when you went there, did you know something at least?
No, I did not know. Like most Jews, I did not know anything, except that Israel was a pioneering state. Israel needed to defend itself. Israel was made up of Jews, those basic things. But in the 1950s and 60s in Hebrew school and in the press in general, there was little information other than a pro-Israel slant. And I could feel that slant as a Jew, but I didn't really participate in it in any depth or know much about it. So I would say I was, like most Jews, ignorant. And my schooling had not helped and had actually promoted my ignorance.
Well, I would say the same thing. When I visited Israel, I was on a pilgrimage, and like most pilgrims, you have all of these categories are, if you travel as a tourist or you travel as a pilgrim, you're in a box, and you sort of see things from that box. So as a pilgrim, you are expected to be in those places where it's supposed to be of some historical or religious significance. You go there with others and you do all your rituals and stuff. And then I remember it was only, I was there for a month, and at some point I really got bored because of all of this. You go to the same places, and you do the same thing. You take photos, and although it was a very good trip, because we were guided by archaeologists and historians and religious teachers and all. But it was only when, at one day, I decided I wouldn't go with the group. I wouldn't go with the pack. And I decided, and with Sister Patricia Fox, with you met, we decided that we're going to go on our way, and we're not going to join. And we went to corners of the old city of Jerusalem, where we have never, we have never, it's not part of the itinerary. And it was the most interesting. It was the most interesting part of the trip. And we met a Palestinian who was an original, his family has been there for decades. I mean, maybe a century. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Well, I didn't experience that because you have to think of where I grew up in North Miami Beach, Florida, and it's the 1950s and 60s that I grew up. So the Middle Eastern culture was very foreign to me. And when I went into the old city of Jerusalem, which was very Palestinian Arab at that time, no longer, but very much so, it was a very strange experience for me, and a culturally different experience. But I was also on a low budget, so I was staying at hostels that were Palestinian Arab, and I didn't really make a distinction, except I slept in Jerusalem outside on a deck and all, and but I didn't know what was going on. I was just interacting with people commercially and otherwise. And they would have seen me as a tourist, and I was somewhat of a tourist, but not exactly. And so when you went as a pilgrim, that was much more a box, which you got out of. I didn't really have a box because I was by myself, and I was just wandering around and looking.
Yeah.
And experiencing a lot of Arab buses, and so I was with people, but I didn't know anyone, and I couldn't communicate with them. I didn't know Arabic, and they probably thought I was just a young tourist that they had seen around. My hair was long, and they probably just thought of me as an American tourist, and they didn't think of me as Jewish at all. I'm sure. So I was naive, but I was searching in a way, but without a particular agenda.
Yeah. So it wasn't like, those birthright
No.
trips. No, nothing like that. Okay.
That didn't exist.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the next trip to Israel, Palestine, and can you tell what's the difference that time when you travel?
Well, I was invited to Tantur, which is a Protestant ecumenical um, institute that came out of Vatican II, and the Protestants that were invited to Vatican II, I think it's Catholic property, as recall, and I was invited by a person who was directing Tantur at the time, Donald Nichols from the UK, who I believe was Anglican. And I was invited to speak on the prophetic because I had already written 2 books, A Year at the Catholic Worker and a biography of Peter Morin. And my Peter Morin biography was subtitled Prophet in the 20th Century, Prophetic Voice in the 20th Century. And it was about the prophetic and how prophetic community across faith lines had been developing in the 20th century, including Gandhi and King and Dorothy Day and Peter Morin and Simone Weil. So it wasn't specifically Jewish. And I don't know how he got my name. I don't know if he had read one of my books. There was a Maryknoll sister. I was teaching at Maryknoll at the time. And there was a Maryknoll sister who might have been working there, or maybe she gave my name. I had founded an Institute for Justice and Peace at Maryknoll. Anyway, I was invited. And in that invitation, I said I would go, but only if they would allow me to stay for a couple of weeks at their complex so I could meet Palestinians. And they said, fine. I didn't know how I would meet Palestinians, but I just had a sense that I needed to do it and I wanted to do it, and I would go if I would be given the opportunity, which I didn't know how it would develop, to meet Palestinians. And when I arrived there, I met a woman, Kathy Bergen, from the Mennonite Central Committee that had worked with Palestinians since the formation of the State of Israel and the Palestinian refugee crisis that occurred because of that. And she agreed. I talked with her several times and convinced her to take me around to meet Palestinians. This was very controversial for them to be associated with Jews like me, because they were working with Palestinians. Very controversial for a Jew to go into those areas, and very controversial for Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza to receive a Jew. But she had a sense that it was important, and I kept bothering her about it. And we started traveling into the West Bank. She took me to places, she knew the people, and then I went to Gaza. And through that experience of meeting Palestinians, again, very foreign to me and foreign to them, but they received me, and sometimes I was told I should tell them I'm Jewish, and sometimes I shouldn't, depending on the area we were in or the type of people we were meeting with. And anyway, I saw what was happening, what had happened and what was happening. I still didn't know the history. I knew more than 1973. But my experience of that encounter at Tantur, because I was there for 2 weeks and I was meeting people through Tantur and then through Kathy Bergen and the Mennonite Central Committee, I was meeting more and more Palestinians. And I said to myself, I have to speak about this. I have to find my voice on this question as a Jew. Especially in Gaza when I was there, and I remember sitting with families, very poor families in Gaza, who had portraits, photos framed, but in very simple frames and hanging by a nail in their very poorly constructed homes of children who had been killed by the Israeli military, and they referred to them as martyrs. And I thought to myself, they're referring to their children as martyrs who were martyred by Jews, that is, Israeli soldiers. And at first it was, I had grown up being taught about Jewish martyrdom, not only in the Holocaust, but well before that. Mm-hmm. And was told that the prayer of God's unity, the Shema, was a prayer of God's unity, but also the martyr's prayer. It was often the prayer that Jews said before they were to be martyred. So I was very familiar with Jewish martyrdom. But now, and then at Maryknoll, I was becoming familiar with Catholics being martyred in Latin America. And I thought, wow, not for trying to convert, quote, pagans to Catholicism, but because of their work for justice. So this whole question of martyrdom was shifting. And sitting in Gaza with a family, I remember sitting on the floor of a home that didn't have a floor. It was just the ground. And seeing that photo and having a discussion translated, and they kept saying Jew had killed them, Jews had killed them. And I thought to myself, Jews can't do that, can they? Can we? And I was confronted not with a theoretical question, but with the reality. Israeli soldiers had murdered them. And why? Because they were struggling for their own freedom. And that question of martyrdom was devastating to me. So how could I talk after the Holocaust, which I was very involved in the study of Holocaust theology? What can we say about God after the Holocaust? What can we say about humanity after the Holocaust? What can we say about being Jewish after the Holocaust? And now I was confronting another level of what we have done after the Holocaust and what we are doing to Palestinians. So that trip in 1984, and thinking, I don't remember what prompted me to think I have to meet Palestinians. It's nobody said that to me. I wasn't around people who were talking about it. I was quite alone as a Jew at Maryknoll, obviously, all surrounded by Catholics. But I had this feeling that I couldn't talk critically about Christianity and Catholicism in particular any longer if I didn't find out and confront a more critical sense of what it meant to be Jewish now. I couldn't stay in the Holocaust and say Christian anti-Semitism, and the oppression of that Christians had brought about to Jews. And I was learning about a global Christianity. Most of the Christians in the world had been conquered by Christianity. And I didn't know anything about that until I went to Maryknoll. So in that liberationist atmosphere at Maryknoll, God liberating the poor, I had to ask the question, since we as Jews had suffered and were now liberated, would we be free in our liberation if we oppressed another people? And there I was, traveling with, meeting, discussing, and sitting with those whom we were oppressing. So to be honest, part of it was just an honesty. I couldn't keep pointing my finger at Christians as if we were innocent. But how to say that after the Holocaust as a Jew, when Israel was seen as a refuge, and in some ways it was, for survivors of the Holocaust, and a symbol of Jewish empowerment, which I believed we need that empowerment, not necessarily in a state, and certainly not over against another people. So it was this mixture of where I was at Maryknoll, going around the world among Christians, liberation theology, and then realizing that I had to take ownership of my own tradition, and then being with Palestinians and saying, this is unacceptable. We cannot do this, although we were, and we still are.
So when you uh, realize or have decided that you should speak about it, did you think of any, any, what would be the consequences of speaking about it? Or what were you thinking when you said, I needed to speak about it? I mean, what were your thoughts about how would you speak about it? To whom would you speak about it? And what do you expect to uh, get out of speaking about it?
Well, if I had thought about any of that, I would have never spoken.
Yeah, so it was there was a certain naivete
Yeah,
in that sense.
it,
Yeah.
it, didn't actually. I've thought about this often because people asked me, and the answer is I didn't think about. I can't remember thinking about any of that. Now, I don't know why I didn't think about any of that. Part of it is naivete, and sometimes naivete is very, very important in our lives. But I never had then, and don't have today, a strategy. If I had had a strategy,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have spoken, or spoken a little and not much. And I would have wound up like many of the others who were progressive Jews who spoke some but shaded their speech and really were enablers of the occupation of Palestine. So I don't, I have never been, and I could be criticized for this too, and it certainly didn't help me in certain areas, a strategic thinker. I'm very suspicious of strategic thought. That doesn't mean that there can't be any strategy in thinking ultimately or thinking politically, but when it came to this issue of oppressing another people, there wasn't going to be a strategy. It was wrong. That's what I felt. Wrong. Simple. Not. I don't want to tell you I had complex thoughts about it. I did not. I did not wake up in the middle of the night stewing about it and writing down different things and thinking about what I should say. I did none of that. I went home and I wrote an article toward a Jewish theology of liberation, which was published ultimately in 1985. But a group before I had gone over, a socialist magazine had gotten in touch with me, or someone brought me there to New York City, and I had talked with them about my trip, and they were very interested in what I was doing and wanted me to write an article for their journal. So when I returned, so I wrote it, and they didn't like it because I talked also about the Holocaust, and that wasn't in their Marxist framework. It was a Marxist journal. And when I spoke to them after I returned, there was a Catholic nun, young, Rosalinda Ramirez. I don't know that I'd ever met a Puerto Rican before, who was there when I spoke, a small group, to this socialist magazine. And when they rejected my article, although they liked what I had to say in general, they were very supportive, she brought me over to the National Council of Churches. And in one of the offices, there was the beginning of a journal, Theology in the Americas. This was the counterpart to liberation theology in Latin America. There would be a liberation theology in the Americas, but basically in North America, I think that they were emphasized. And they took my article, and it was their first issue, and they published it with responses from major theologians. It was the whole issue, my article and their responses. Unfortunately, the journal ceased publication soon after, I don't think because of my article. But that was, my first article was published in 1985 in a journal titled Theology in the Americas. And the interest was so high. I was at Maryknoll, which publishes Orbis Books, and I spoke to the main editor there, Philip Sharper, who had been a very old-time Catholic editor, very well-known, very nice man. And he said to me, you should write a book toward a Jewish theology of liberation. I thought, oh. Now that's much longer than an article. And I thought to myself, I don't know enough about, I hadn't been taught this. It wasn't in mainstream media, and it wasn't even in theological journals and all. It really wasn't being talked about, especially as a Jew. And so I began to gather information, just grabbing whatever I could, and theology wherever I could, and started a narrative that I had to construct by myself. I was very isolated, and no one could help me, and I didn't ask for help. I was trying to find my voice, and that's the book I wrote, which was published in 1987. So I started writing that book right after the article was published. And again, while I was writing it, I never thought about strategy, and I never thought about consequence or consequences. It just didn't enter my mind. And it certainly wasn't a career thing. I never thought of my intellectual life in terms of a career. And at Maryknoll, I was traveling all over the world. I wasn't going to any academic conferences, and I wasn't interested in that. I was going to Latin America and Africa and Asia, exploring the world. As a Jew, I was traveling Jewish. And as I began to form this Jewish theology of liberation, my sense of Jewishness became deepened. And so I was even more aware of traveling as a Jew, because now I was beginning to speak not just as a justice-seeking person, but as a Jewish justice-seeking person. And running into all sorts of things: people who wanted to hear Jews, people who didn't want to hear Jews, people who loved Jews, people who hated Jews, people who were ambivalent about. Anyway, all of that and the experience of Palestinians was forcing me to think about things in relation to my Jewishness, which I had never thought about and might never have thought about. And I was thinking even today that of all my encounters with Richard Rubinstein in Holocaust theology, Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker, that my visit to Tantur, which I wanted to meet Palestinians. I don't remember why exactly. Something was happening within me, and some news, I suppose. That was the most decisive encounter in my life. I've had many encounters, including when I turned down a graduate fellowship from Vanderbilt and went to the Catholic Worker instead, which was a huge thing. But the most decisive encounter in my life as a Jew was the meeting of Palestinians who were on the underside of Jewish power.
And you refer that as the prophetic coming home.
Yes, because Jews, and I was raised like this too. I was raised in a liberal Jewish home, like many Jews of my generation, and we were for justice for everybody, especially African Americans. This is in the 50s and 60s. This was the chosen people of America in our view. So I was raised in a liberal Jewish home, and therefore the prophetic was universal. We were for justice. I mean, we thought Christians weren't, and in many cases they weren't. And Jews were for blacks, but Christians were racist. In many cases they were, not in all cases. We had all of this. Some of it was mythic, but also parts of it were true. And women were very prized, and women were going to work outside of the home, and Jews were for that in general. And so we were very good on all the issues, except Palestinians were a blank, either negative or a blank. So the encounter with Palestinians was the Jewish prophetic coming home. And the Holocaust theology, which I had learned about and I was deeply embedded in and wrote a lot about, basically was afraid of the prophetic coming home. That's a major theme in my writing, is that Holocaust theology, which had great depth about God and the questions about God, and I still think so, were silent about the oppression of Palestinians. And they wanted to keep that silence and referred to speech about Palestinians in a positive way as either anti-Semitic or self-hating if a Jew did that. They were very afraid that the universal prophetic message that Jews had carried, which now had been transferred to Israel and Jewish empowerment, would now shift to what's happening to Palestinians. And I was one of the first, without knowing it, without planning it, without having a strategy. I was thinking about it today too, again, that in a sense, the Jewish prophetic coming home came home in me. Now, there were other Jews too, but there were very few of us. And over time now, there are many, many more. But I was, in some way, without being able to define it or making any great claims about it, my traveling Jewish was the Jewish prophetic coming home within me, but through me in my writing and my further traveling, it became more distinctive and has also touched some others. And the generation of Jews, my generation, a few before, but more after me, that is very distinctive. The Jewish prophetic coming home deeply disturbed the Jewish, what I call the Jewish Constantinian establishment. Because, for good reasons, we wanted to make it in America. We had just been displaced, murdered in Europe, and many reasons we wanted to assimilate with our distinctive Jewishness, but the prophetic was out when it came to self-criticism. But that's what the prophetic is. The prophetic was never really universal. That's Christianity. That's another topic. But for Jewish, the prophetic has always been the internal critique. And in my travels as a Jew, traveling Jewish, that came home. And I realized through all the trials and tribulations that come with it, now I realize that that was my homecoming as a Jew. And it was my way of being faithful as a Jew. And in my view, it's the only way to be faithful as a Jew today. Solidarity with Palestinian freedom is the only way to be faithful as a Jew today, in my view. Now because that also opens up all these other questions. It's easy for us to say, let Latinos into the United States. But there's no problem. That's a universal sense. Jews in general are in favor of it. We don't live next to the people. We're very distant from all of that, and we're also good about it. But that's at no cost to us. We're all in favor of women being free and being able to do what they want, but that's also good for us. We want to accept Muslims in the United States and elsewhere, and they should be good Muslims and we'll be good Jews, but that's at no cost to us. The cost was Palestine, because there we were doing something wrong. And that tarnished our own self-image as Jews as good and Jews as innocent. And that was my second phase of writing. As I learned more through the writing and through the speaking, because even in Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, you've got a lot of stuff there, but I was discovering it. Israel as a global arms dealer. Who knew about that as a Jew? Giving arms to El Salvador and Guatemala and South Africa. And, this was unknown to most Jews, and almost every Jew didn't know it. So I was discovering it in Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. But my next book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, which I published in 1990, was much more learned. But still, my point was not to show my learning. I I wasn't trying to impress people by my learning. I was learning and I was speaking.
Okay, so this is to wrap up the conversation for today. What would you say about Jews who choose to go into the universal? Is that a deflection, or what can you say about, because until now Jews are engaged and very that's very good that Jews are engaged in all kinds of justice issues. But what can you say about those who have into this universal justice seeking, but downplays or even ignores the Palestinian cause?
It's a deflection. Jewish universality, of course, the prophetic evolves and is always contextual too, and so is universality. But to be, Elie Wiesel used to speak for those refugees from Central America coming into the United States, but he had nothing to say about Palestinians. So it was a deflection. So now today, I would say, and we could talk about other issues more broadly, a universal Jewish prophetic without central being freedom for Palestinians is a false universal. The only way we can get to a universal again is through Palestinian freedom. So somebody who is for immigration reform into the United States but doesn't want to talk about Palestinians, I wouldn't listen to that. And I even have arguments with people who are very good on the Palestinians, but they want to do this. And as American citizens, they should be for justice and all of these good things. Good. That's not a mark of Jewishness today. It may have been a mark of Jewishness in the 1950s or the early 60s. Today, there's only one mark of Jewishness. Where do you stand on what Israel has done and is doing to the Palestinian people? And what are you willing to say, and to whom? That's the question.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Ellis. I think that we will end our discussion for now on that note. And thank you so much for this very engaging and quite very challenging conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.